Well, as we come to the last day, class day of another week, we notice some empty chairs, and there'll be two more over the weekend and Monday, I guess. And Oliver and Millie take their departure from us for what we pray will be but a little time. We shall see what works out. But you're leaving tomorrow morning? Early. Well, I didn't specifically mention you last evening, but I trust the spirit of that meditation abides with you and will be with you in the way. We have been going through the process of becoming oriented in relationship to some of the obscurities of the past. The basic patterns which were involved in relationship to the fall of man, and we carried the pattern forward so that you could see that the period covered by Old Testament history was under a water, fire, fire pattern. There are a few other points which could be considered at some length, which we will only touch upon very briefly now, with respect to the period prior to the time of the children of Israel. I would like to draw attention to one or two obvious facts first. You recall that in days gone by, there was a period when Mars, the planet, was worshipped as a god. And there was another period when the planet Venus was worshipped as a god. If you go out and look up at the sky at a time when either Venus or Mars are visible in the sky, do you see anything that should be so outstandingly different from the other planets that the ancients would particularly pick out such planets as objects of worship? The simple answer is you do not. There is not enough difference in relationship to the appearance in the sky, not enough obvious relationship to warrant any such adoration or concern or fear as was once shown toward these planets. In other words, we have, right on the face of it, obvious evidence that these planets were not always functioning in the orbits where they now are. We have obvious evidence that they were in some other position than they are in relationship to our own planet. Now, we will not attempt to go into that extensively. We have some text material on this point in relationship to what has been gathered on a very scientific basis as evidence. And in a general sense, the outline as it is given is very good. Some of the interpretations, some of the conclusions drawn from the scientific evidence we cannot agree with. But the scientific evidence itself stands and is worthy of a good deal of consideration. Perhaps we will have time to go into it somewhat later on. But going back for the moment to some of the things that worked out in relationship to the processes of the fall. Up to the time when the fall took place, there was no disturbance in the patterns of polarity. The cycles were working normally, but it was through man, the focalization of creation, that these currents were working in relationship to creation. When man was in right polarity, the planet itself and the various levels of creation were held in polarity, in relationship to the cosmic scheme of things. But when the fall had taken place, from the divine standpoint, there were certain problems which were posed. Those who did not fall, those who maintained the right pattern, were keeping the earth in right polarity and maintaining conditions where it made it seem that those who were functioning wrongly were not reaping any ill results of their wrong actions, because the right pattern was maintained for them and all around them. And consequently, they took the attitude that, see, we are doing as we please, and the ill results which were suggested simply have not appeared. And therefore, they felt justified and were utterly unrepentant. Everything within that scope of the pattern was done to give them ample opportunity to return to the divine design. And it was not at all necessary that all these thousands of years of suffering and misery and sorrow and death should have followed. To say that man turned away and that God couldn't do anything about it, that man then had to go through all this long cycle, and that Jesus Christ had to come into the world and all the rest of it just because man originally fell, is utterly wrong. There was plenty of opportunity at that time for those who had turned into the wrong path to repent. But the violent results did not immediately appear, not in the sense that would carry conviction. One of the points that we notice with respect to the outworking as it is given in the blueprint which we call the Book of Revelation is that there should come a point when there would be a basic recognition that just and righteous altogether are thy judgments, O Lord. And as long as there was a pattern where it would appear that God's judgments were not just and righteous, the thing had to be proven out. In other words, merely because God could foresee such and such a result, merely because from the divine standpoint there was a definite recognition of what would take place and that it would be justified to take such and such an action, those who were not functioning in relationship to that level of consciousness and who simply could not see that there was any justification in taking the attitude toward them that was taken, they felt self-righteous and took the attitude that God wasn't being fair, that his judgments weren't right. I've had that same attitude displayed toward me many a time. Well, then what was to be done? The thing had to prove itself out. It was not God's purpose or intention that death should appear on the earth and all the miseries that produce death. There are those who believe that God created man and intended that man should fall. He didn't intend that man should remain in some kind of a perfect state, that God wasn't fair to man. Man at that time was just like a little child. He didn't know right from evil, and he made this mistake, and then he did this, and he did that, so on. And God either condemned everybody just because one who is comparable to a child made a mistake, which would be unjust, or else God intended that man should fall. So, man's rationalizations, attempting to work out an idea that would not make it appear that God was too unjust, have us brought about a conclusion that God simply intended man to fall, and that death is a part of the divine plan. It's a part of a school, or part of an opportunity to grow, or something. And I might mention, just as an illustration, how this thing works. Our airport operator, Marvin Lamb, who was also my instructor when I was learning to fly, a very fine man. Most of you, I think, have met him. And last Sunday, his aunt and uncle, his mother's youngest brother and his wife, were killed almost instantly in an automobile accident. And the follow-up of this particular, or the foreground of this, was that a year and a half ago, her eldest brother was likewise killed in an automobile accident. Well, with that background pattern and all the factors involved and the levels of consciousness, etc., you can imagine something about what the general pattern of family feeling was and is. And I undertook to give a little, what shall we say, spiritual support. Without saying too much, I couldn't launch into a sermon on the subject, so just in conversation I was undertaking to give some spiritual encouragement, particularly to Marvin, and trusting that he could carry it to his other relatives, to his mother particularly. And he recalled a funeral sermon that had been given by a minister of his acquaintance some years ago. I had made the approach of expressing, with respect to the type of funeral sermon that I give, indicating particular concern for the living. It was based on the idea of helping those who remained. I was more concerned about those who remained than those who had gone. And the point had come up that some ministers apparently take the occasion to do their best to, well, make people sad and cry and feel utterly miserable. Tear-jerking sermons. And talking along this line, and he brought up this sermon that he had heard. To his mind, it was after the pattern of what I had suggested. I had introduced something, hoping to expand it a little bit. And this is what it suggested to his mind, the sermon that he had heard. And he didn't really see what I was getting at all. But in this sermon, the minister had emphasized the point that in order for life to be, death had to be. That there couldn't be life without death, and so we should be thankful for death, because it was by reason of death that we could have life. Now you can see how, in an ordinary pattern, a minister could take that and go to town with it, shall we say. Well, when that idea came up, I, of course, had nothing more to say. I couldn't. That was the basis of such solace as he had at the moment. I didn't have any opportunity or right pattern to refute it. All I could do is just leave him with such consolation as he had. And if that pleased him, well, that's his business. Perhaps someday it'll open up so I can talk to him, but at the moment, that was that. And so I left it alone. In a case like that, to have attempted to clear the point would have been utterly foolish, futile. Would have done harm rather than good. So, the concept that death is absolutely essential to life is widely held. And the inevitability of death, etc., is greatly emphasized. As the pattern now stands, certain substances of the body or certain parts of the body or some body is going to die, as we say. But death is not at all what it seems to be to human beings. And that which is in the divine scope of things is not death. We have recognized that the divine design was birth and ascension, not birth and death. Once we begin to actually realize that, we can see that God did not intend that man should fall. All of this misery and suffering and sorrow has not been a part of the divine plan. It has all been contrary to God's will, contrary to God's plan. And when I say contrary to God's will, again we come up against one of the popular religious concepts, because there are millions of people that believe that everything that happens is God's will. God is all-powerful, therefore nothing can happen without God's will, and if something happens to you, it's God's will. If there's a tragedy, a death, a suffering, a sickness, an illness, or anything else, it's God's will. And they take the attitude that it would be somehow blasphemous to suggest that anything on the face of the earth happened without it being God's will. Carried out to its logical conclusion, you have to admit that everybody that lies, everybody that murders, everybody that steals, everybody that does anything evil is doing God's will. You can't be logical in that kind of a pattern without carrying it right on and recognizing that it includes everything. Very well. If everyone who does something wrong is doing God's will, then God isn't properly going to punish the person that does His will, is He? He should reward. Gets back to the same point I made with respect to Judas. Because if it was God's will that Jesus Christ should die on the cross in order to save people from their sins, then we must admit that Judas of all men, outside of the master himself, rendered the greatest service to each and every one. And we can't agree to that. No, it wasn't God's will. Judas was not predestined to do that. He was not acting on divine impulse. So we begin to realize, wherever we turn, there is evidence of the fact that it was not God's intention that all of this misery and suffering and sorrow should come into the world. We've had over 20,000 years of a pattern on earth that was not necessary, that God did not intend, and that is not in any sense a fulfillment of His plan. And until we get out of it, we are not in position to continue on in the outworking of His plan. So, the immediate goal is to get man out of this situation. That is merely an incidental plan to the situation. Man has come to act as if he believed that God's whole purpose and plan was to save man, and after that was done, there's nothing else. But God's plan did not include the fall of man. That was not the purpose or intent. And until we get back into that pattern that God did design, we will not be functioning according to our true purpose. So, this work of bringing about the restoration is simply an interim plan and purpose in order to reinstate man in a position where he can function according to the divine plan. Once we begin to see that, we can begin to take the right attitude toward the basic facts of life as they relate to man's present situation. Then we see, going back again to that original point, that those who had fallen were not producing the condition which their acts would naturally produce. Why? Because there were other people in the world who were not functioning in that manner, who were maintaining the polarity as far as the earth itself was concerned, who were maintaining a condition that let evil people, people that were rebellious and following their own fancies, have all the blessings, practically speaking, in an outer sense, of right function. Well, after a reasonable period of time given to those people to repent and return, God had to make a change. Now, God is not a destroyer. He is a creator. So, it would have looked unjust. The surface appearance, the evidence would not have been present to have simply annihilated those people. Said, well, now here, we'll just annihilate you and the rest of the folks will be all right, so we'll go right on. But that's not God's way. And the evidence was not manifest. The judgment would have been in the appearance of an assumption, because the outworking of the cycle was not manifest. God could foresee what the outworking would be, but to judge on that basis without the cycle actually having worked out would have made it appear that God was perhaps unjust. So, the only thing to do after a reasonable period of time was to have all of those who were functioning correctly, except a few, a very few, who were to remain as leaders and teachers to give an opportunity for man, but to have everybody else ascend, a mass ascension of millions of people away from the earth's surface, leaving only a few to be leaders and teachers to whatever degree those who remained would listen, after they began to see the actual evidence of their wrongdoing, the results in manifestation. There had been, to make it a little more exact, partial group ascensions quite a while before the final one, which allowed some evidence to appear, but it wasn't enough to convince the self-active minds of men. They take the attitude, well, you folks go on, we don't care, we don't need you, look, we're getting along all right. This threat that you're all going to ascend and leave us, what difference does that make to us? Go on, we'd like to have the earth all to ourselves. And they took that basic attitude. So the day came when there was a mass ascension of those who remained. And the earth was left to them, with the few exceptions I have mentioned. And so what happened? Those who remained were out of polarity. The cosmic currents working in relationship to the earth had been moving through man, divine man, in polarity. That body of control was removed, and the control factors were consequently gone. So the cosmic currents, which function in relationship to the earth and the solar system and so on, had to be without any means of manifestation or work through man who was out of polarity. Immediately then, the earth itself was thrown out of polarity. the polarity of the earth depends upon the polarity of man as a human family. Not just one or two human beings, no, but the whole human family. The polarity of the earth itself depends upon the polarity of man, meaning mankind. So, immediately the earth itself was thrown out of polarity. It was wrenched suddenly off of its axis. The subterranean supports under the earth crumbled. Fountains of waters gushed out. Flames of fire appeared in violent volcanic eruptions. And over a period of about 7,000 years after this real process of submersion began, the motherland, or Lemuria, was in the process of submersion. Terrific earthquakes and all kinds of things. The earth was reeling to and fro on its axis, much more than it is today, and it was thrown out of its orbit in relationship to the sun. When we have a solar system, a sun with various planets around it, and one planet is suddenly thrown out of its orbit and out of its polarity, are all the other planets going to be unmoved by it? No. Because they have an interrelationship. Their particularized positions depend not just upon the individual planet's relationship to the sun. Our particularized position in the planetary system depends not just on the sun and our planet as such, but upon the influences, gravitational and otherwise, of the other planets of the solar system. Do you see that? It couldn't be any other way. Because no group of bodies in what would be called space, functioning in relationship to each other, can have no influence upon each other. They do have an influence. According to their mass and density and makeup, etc., there are variations of gravitational influence, just to name one thing. And there are many other vibrational factors involved. So when the earth was thrown out of its polarity and out of its orbit, it likewise threw certain other planets out of their orbits. And the pattern worked out so that there was a gravitational mess, shall we say. There were certain of the planets which, due to these factors, and they worked out in relationship to some comets. I'm going to have to bring in the pattern of comets here to make this clear. The comets of which we are aware, the comets which come within the range of our vision so that we can see them and know about them and chart them and so on, are a part of our solar system. I don't know whether you knew that or not, but you can study into it if you wish. From the standpoint of astronomy, they have the sun as their point of orientation, our sun. And these comets, which are a part of our solar system, are likewise a part of the basic material factors of our relationship with the rest of the universe. In other words, a rather limited but suggestive illustration would be the fact that there are red blood corpuscles. Suppose you figure the heart is the center of the physical organism, and we have various organs at certain distances from the heart, and certain members of the body, like hands and feet, which revolve, in a sense, around the heart, or function in relationship to it. But there's likewise something that goes to the heart and goes out to the extremities and back again, the circulation of blood, or the red blood corpuscles, etc. Now, of course, the application of the principle is different in relationship to you as a human being, but just exactly as that is true in you as a human being, the relationship of this planetary system with the rest of the universe had to be established on a basis that was not just purely spiritual, shall we say. There had to be physical factors. And the comets, of which there are many, are a part of this pattern. When things were thrown out of polarity, and the comets were functioning as they did, they have a part in maintaining particularized balance and rhythm in the movement of the planets themselves. And there were certain planets which were thrown into a comet pattern. I might mention that there is still one of the planets which belongs in this solar system as a planet, which is still, to this day, functioning as a comet. Now we talk about physical changes in a solar system, physical changes in relationship to the Earth. These things do not come about all just because of what we might call spiritual means, the idea of changing the pattern in relationship to the Earth. How is it that the Earth itself is going to be caused to move in the future yet on a basis which makes it seem that the heavens are rolled together as a scroll? Suppose you are standing here on the Earth's surface and looking up at the sky, and suddenly, because of variations in gravitational pattern, the Earth is thrown suddenly on its axis and rolled over the other way. You're used to its rolling one way. How about having it roll the other way on its axis, or north to south, we'll say? If you were looking up at the sky under that circumstance, aside from a lot of other things that will be happening, it would appear that the sky was rolling together as a scroll. And if the Earth is thrown into a serious wobble on its axis, as has been in the case and as has been in the case in the past and as will be the case in the future, we have some very interesting results. Now, the Earth will ultimately, in the outworking of the divine pattern, one way or another, be restored to its normal balance in the axis pattern. This excessive wobble that we have today will be eliminated, and we'll be restored to our proper distance from the sun. We're not out very much from that distance, or human beings couldn't live. See, if the variations were too much, the conditions necessary for the life of man would be gone. So, this is one of the factors which makes it impossible for man under the present time to live more than 100 years or so, generally speaking. Because the Earth itself is out of key. The vibrational factors of the solar system have to be changed. And just you and I, or a few human beings, this group, for instance, even if we begin to function on a reasonably good basis, just that alone is not going to produce the conditions necessary to the perfect fulfillment of the plan. We have to carry on under these conditions until we become powerful enough in relationship to centering, in relationship to control patterns, to allow the vibratory factors to move through us as a means of establishing right polarity for the Earth. But it will be more than that, just as it was more than that at the time of the fall. For at the time this works out, our sister planet, which is at the present time functioning as a comet, and it's because of that that we have been able to maintain conditions in the solar system which would let man live even as long as he does now, is going to be restored to her position as a planet. And the vibratory balance will have to be worked out again. When that planet, which is now acting as a comet, comes back into the solar system, we need to be ready for it. We won't try to restore the Earth to its polarity until the right vibrational conditions have been reached in the sense of the creative processes. Even if we were ready today, and it would take at least 144,000 people who were perfectly centered and coordinated as a control pattern to even begin to think about it. But suppose we were ready today, which we are not, we would still have to wait until the cycles of time worked out, the right vibratory patterns were developed, and the time had come in these patterns of movement for our sister planet to return to the solar system. But when that time comes, we had better be ready. Now, we don't have too much time. In other words, you can't say, well, if that's the case, it doesn't make any difference what we do. It does. We'd better be getting ready, or we will have trouble. But that means that a whole new vibrational pattern will be reestablished in the solar system, and so in the Earth. A vibrational pattern which will make it possible for man to actually do what he was created to do, equipped to do. We cannot expect now, under this vibrational pattern, to live for, say, 5,000 years. That's what man was created to do, any length of time necessary, as I've pointed out before. But until we reestablish the right conditions, we're not going to do that. So, we'd better do our part toward reestablishing the right conditions. That's part of our job now. And from the standpoint of what the Master did, we talk about the salvation of man. What is the salvation of man? It is the outworking of this whole plan so that the solar system and our planet can be restored to the divine estate. And until they are, man certainly is not going to have the opportunity to live according to the full pattern of that divine estate. We can reach a certain degree of development and accomplishment under conditions as they are. Far more than has been. There's no block ahead of you. Don't worry about it. But that is as much a part of the salvation of man as anything that anyone can do. That's what was part of the program when our Master came into the world. The idea that it was all worked out when he died on the cross, as people put it, is so utterly infantile when one begins to see the truth of the matter, that we see that the salvation of man requires the restoration of the earth itself to its proper point and pattern of function in the cosmic scheme of things. So, just as the earth was thrown out of polarity, so will the earth be brought back into polarity. And the comets will have a part to play, other planets will have a part to play. And there was a period, during Old Testament history even, when certain of the planets, Mars, Venus, in the different cycles, were actually so close to the earth that they had an appearance of being much larger than our moon. And there was fire the gravitational pulls involved between the two, electrical discharges manifesting between the two. And it is no wonder that the people then looked up in the sky and saw this great fiery monster, as it appeared to them, and worshipped it. It wasn't in its present place in the solar system. Now, if you've never heard anything like that before, it may sound a little fantastic to begin with, but we can look into it, we can examine it, because what I'm talking about is a scientific fact. And there is a physical factor in relationship to all of these things. For instance, you go back and consider some of the things that are spoken of in the Old Testament, and people will say, well, that's just a physical impossibility. The earth standing still, or this happening, that happening. What was it that produced the peculiar conditions during the time when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness? What was the manna from heaven? All right. The manna from heaven was something that was peculiar to that particular time and period when there had been a near collision between our earth and another planet. And there was a period of about 40 years when they did not see the sun. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Is this just something fantastic that someone dreamed up? Or is it something supernatural? No. There are sound, scientific, physical facts in relationship to every one of these incidents, and they're not just something imaginary or something achieved by some peculiar mystic means. And once we begin to realize that there is a basic scientific physical fact back of every one of these outworkings, we'll begin to see that we're not trying to do something that can't be done. Because whatever we do here, we're working on the basis of those scientific facts, not to try to achieve the impossible, but to set up vibratory conditions which will make it possible for us to utilize certain physical facts which are yet in the future. And if we're not ready when they come, it'll be just too bad. So we intend to be ready. And all of these things are basic. And once you begin to see them, I think maybe I'll have to take a little time from the nature of the vibratory pattern here this morning. I think maybe I'm going to have to take a little time to really study some of these things with you, just enough at least to let you see what I'm talking about. But all of these things were working out during the period of the time of the children of Israel. That is, certain of these things were, and some of them back beyond that. But now I wanted to bring out into focus one other point for you to see what happened. Because as I indicated the other day, with respect to the graph of life, man went through a process of devolution, or descending, before he started to come back up to the level where he now is. He didn't come out of oblivion, developing out of an amoeba or something. Man, as a divine being, was. Man fell, the graph of life went down very rapidly after the submersion of Atlantis, the continent that was on the Earth's surface where the Atlantic Ocean now is. I might mention that the story of driving man out of the Garden of Eden here, as it's touched on so briefly in the Bible, is the story of the submersion of Lemuria. And about 1,000 years later, there was the submersion of Atlantis. And that story is the same as the story of the flood in the Bible is the same story as the submersion of Atlantis. Driving man, as it's pictured here, out of the Garden of Eden. The submersion of Lemuria, or the motherland. And about 1,000 years later, Atlantis went down. And of course, we have all recognized that at that time, or during those periods, there were vast portions of this continent were underwater. Plenty of geological evidence of it. You can find something that belonged at the bottom of the sea on top of our highest mountains. How did it happen? Well, I can tell you how it happened. Because until you begin to see how this old earth has been pushed and pulled and jammed and shoved around, you can't understand it. And it didn't take millions of years, as some have supposed, because those who developed those fantastic concepts, and that's what they are actually, didn't have any idea of what the physical factors back of all of this were. And so we'll take a little look at it. But when the submersion of Atlantis took place, during that 1,000 years there was quite a development. Atlantis became the centering of world government after it was lost from Lemuria, and civilization began to pick up again. 1,000 years. How long have we been on this continent? How long have we been on this continent? When was it that Columbus sailed the ocean blue? 1492? About 500 years? Would you say? Huh? About 500 years. And all of this, all of our great cities, all of the things we've done, our railroads, everything, 500 years, we've accomplished all of this. Now, of course, they were in much better position to accomplish things in the days of Atlantis. And they had 1,000 years. Stop and look at it that way and you'll begin to see something. Because in 500 years, look what we have done in this day and age. Handicapped as we were, using ox carts and all the rest of it. And look what we've done in this period of time. They had 1,000 years in Atlantis. So when I say there was a considerable period of development, you should begin to understand that there was something really far superior to anything that we have today, even under that regime. But it wasn't what it should have been. And various factors worked out, and Atlantis went down. Then, there were so many changes in the Earth's surface at that time. So many changes in climate, in atmospheric conditions. There were just a few people, comparatively speaking, scattered, isolated. The sudden changes produced what we've called the Ice Age, because that water froze suddenly. We have plenty of scientific proof of that, haven't we? That water became frozen very suddenly. How did it happen? Because of the fact that the earth was reeling to and fro like a drunken man. The wobble was terrific. The climatic conditions changed. What was comparatively a lovely climate became extremely severe, much more severe than we have at the present time, in fact. And these people were isolated. Suppose you, it isn't a very nice thing to imagine, but suppose there were enough atomic bombs fell right here on the earth, on our country, to absolutely wipe out our cities, wreck our communication systems, and have just 2 or 3 people here, maybe 3 or 4 over there, hiding in the mountains, living in caves, no resources as we think of them today, no cars, no airplanes, nothing, just civilization wiped out, and a few scattered, actually maybe over the whole earth, a few thousand people. Of course, it's pictured here in the story of the flood, just as Noah and his family. Well, allegorically, that's true. But there were several thousand people in different parts of the earth who were saved. This is the story given allegorically with respect to one family. But there were other families who were saved. The point is that these people didn't know whether anyone else lived on the face of the earth or not. They had no means of communication. The second to third generation, and generations would become very short there, wouldn't they? You'd have to be using clubs to kill some animals to get some food. The earth itself was covered with a density of clouds and dust and so on till you couldn't see the sun. You couldn't tell what the directions were. For a long time they didn't know what was north or south. They couldn't see the stars. They couldn't see the sun or the moon. And it was cold, bitter cold. They were living in caves, trying to find some wild animals, get their skins to clothe themselves and so on. Oh, there was a caveman age, sure enough. But it came on so suddenly, and how rapidly under those conditions, when every resource had to be given to the preservation of physical life, how rapidly would the consciousness of things gone by disappear. A grandparent talking to his grandson, trying to tell him something about what was before. He would have nothing to go by. The child couldn't see it. It would sound like Grandpa's a little nutty, you know. He's a little cracked. He talks about such things as that. Why, we all know that such a thing couldn't be. Grandpa saw it, grandson did not, and that quickly it's all turned legend and myth. Do you see what I mean? And in a few years, 50 years even, suppose our civilization was wiped out and there were only 300 or 400 people left, scattered all over. They didn't know that anyone else was there. Perhaps they're the only survivors, each one thinking that. How long would it take? And if going through the woods, Grandpa and grandson stumbled on something peculiar. Grandson doesn't know what it is. What is that, grandfather? That's what we used to call a railroad track. Here's a little part that didn't get covered up. Some old rusty rails shining through the weeds and the undergrowth. I'll try to tell you what a railroad was like. Now let's see. How can I tell you what a railroad was like? A railroad engine, no way of telling. Railroad train, no way of telling. Pieces of metal there. And Grandpa gets dreamy and he tries to tell grandson about it, and grandson shakes his head. Grandpa's sure just about gone. Can't you see the picture? Well, that is what happened when, after the submersion of Atlantis, and the earth was plunged into that particular state, and man forgot all about everything except trying to survive in a few very widely scattered points. And he was living in caves. How quickly does he revert to primarily an animal pattern under those circumstances? He has no means but his own wit and strength and a club to kill wild animals to get something to eat, skins to clothe himself with. And so when I say in 500 years, remember, we've accomplished all this building up in 500 years. Does it sound so fantastic then when I say 500 years from the time of the submersion of Atlantis, there were just a few scattered tribes, a few cavemen here and a few nomads there, and civilization as it had been known was gone. Those tribes were, in most cases, enemies to each other. They didn't trust each other, and so on. And there you see the picture of the low point to which man went down. And gradually he began to come up out of that. And finally, in the early dawn of history, we see Egypt appearing on the horizon We begin to see the Near East. We can begin to see something of that development working out in the Oriental pattern. And going back, we can see something with respect to what was the fact down here in Central America, or what we call Mexico now, and on down into the South America and the Aztecs, etc. And all that you can do is go back 5,000 or 6,000 BC in history. So man was emerging for several thousand years to get up to the point where he had reached a state of civilization that allowed him to begin to make a record of his doings. Isn't that what we call civilization? Man reaches a point where he starts making a record of what he does. So you have history. He begins to have an organized society. And that was the dawn of history as we know it. But I've given you just a tiny glimpse of the history that went before it, so that you can begin to see something of the influences. And we haven't been on a long journey up from the state of an amoeba. We have a background of divine man, the fall of man, this plunge into the caveman stage in the Ice Age, and so on. Why did the great layers of ice come plowing down across the Earth's surface as they did? If I take you up, I can show you territory right out here on our plains, where you can see an edge of where a great glacier came plowing along, pushing earth in front of it, and then got that far and melted. Edge of it right out here. I've flown over it many, many times. Oh yes, glacial action, all the rest of it, things that geology hasn't been able to comprehend, except to know that there had to be an ice age. And because they didn't know about this sudden shifting on the Earth's axis and all of these other things, they imagined it had to creep down there to take millions of years. Let's see, glaciers travel so fast, don't they? All right, it takes so many million years for that glacier to reach from the North Pole right out there. Presto changeo, you have the millions of years of evolution. But that isn't the case at all. You begin to see how and why these things happen, and you begin to understand the sound scientific facts back of them. And remember that only as we are scientific and fundamental in relationship to these things can we cause spiritual understanding to have any real value in living. Class dismissed.